3 weeks ago, I'd never heard the words Nirosta Steel in my life, and now in certain online music circles, they are almost inescapable. But why is it that there's so many people that are listening to this double album assembled from recordings made across more than 4 decades by a relatively obscure artist? Why is it that it's received such extraordinary acclaim? And why is it that people seem to be unable to stop talking about it? Well, based on what I've been able to dig up, I'm going to try to answer those questions in this video. The most obvious answer is Arthur Russell. Stephen Hall, the man behind the Nirosta Steel name, was a frequent collaborator and close friend of the underground singer-songwriter and cult legend. To Russell fans, My Skyscraper offered the chance to hear previously unreleased music involving the iconic songwriter and cellist. But if Arthur Russell were the album's only appeal, the conversation would have ended there, and I wouldn't be making this video. So, Stephen Hall is a 69-year-old singer and multi-instrumentalist who grew up just outside Glasgow in Scotland. And as a young teenager, he performed in church choirs, youth outreach programs, where he developed an appreciation for vocal harmony. And you can hear that on tracks like You Have Eaten My Assistant, where Hall's vulnerable falsetto, it's kind of crying out for this harmonic partner to ground it. And then when he was 15, his family moved to Delaware in the United States, and Hall had already become infatuated with New York through its vibrant 1960s art scene, figures like Andy Warhol. And after arriving in America, he became increasingly interested in the city's poetry world. The poet Larry Fagin became something of a mentor to him, and through that circle, Hall met the poet and lecturer Allen Ginsberg, who was the one that introduced him to Arthur Russell. And that poetic background is evident in Hall's lyricism, which I'll return to later. In New York, Hall immersed himself in the city's burgeoning gay disco culture, and My Skyscraper draws heavily from art pop and mutant disco on tracks like Go for the Night, sounds that were especially prominent in New York during the 1970s and 1980s. And he threw himself into the city's nightlife, and the record's sexual themes are far from mere undertones, shall we say. Throughout his adult life, he also developed a deep connection with Asia. He spent extended periods performing and immersing himself in the queer scenes of places like Hong Kong, Thailand, Taiwan, and the track Mohan reflects the connections he formed in China. It's sung entirely in Mandarin, and it features Chinese opera singer Heng Shufeng. In the 2010s, he would join a group called Arthur's Landing, which described its work as an exploration of Arthur Russell's concept of Buddhist pop. If you read interviews with Hall, you will find that it's very clear that the Buddhist ideas profoundly shaped both his and Russell's approach to music. To them, songs were not objects to be completed. They were these evolving pieces. They could sound one way one day, and then completely different another day. And nowhere on My Skyscraper is that more apparent than in the fact that they included not one but 2 versions of the song First Love. They were also both, Hall and Russell, proponents of deep play, which is this idea that playing and learning can happen simultaneously. In an interview that he did with Tone Glow, Hall told them that he wanted this idea of there to be no distinction between rehearsal, performance, and studio recording. And the album's 2 longest songs, Fresh Feeling and Special Weakness, show that philosophy really clearly. Russell's playing the drums on both of those tracks, and Hall is moving through these largely improvised vocal passages. He's kind of searching in real time for ways to express how time changes love and desire and that kind of thing. He's talking about the sort of relationship that he has with people in time and all that kind of thing. That method, it kind of explains why Stephen Hall has this catalogue that's so difficult to navigate. You know, he's written countless songs. This is a man who's been a songwriter for 50 plus years at this point. But this kind of habit of endlessly revising them, combined with the fact that his only real releases are kind of these scattered one-offs. You know, he's got a live recording, he's got a sort of collection of odds and ends, he's got his work with Arthur's Landing, that kind of thing. But there's There's no real point of entry, I suppose. And with no real point of entry, how do you kind of become a fan of an artist? You know, if you listen to Radiohead, for example, someone will say, you know, you should listen to OK Computer. If you want to become a fan of Arthur Russell, someone will say to you, go and listen to World of Echo. If you say, I want to become a fan of Stephen Hall, there's not really an easy point to say, this is what you should go and listen to. You know, even the track list of this album, My Skyscraper, it wasn't constructed by Hall. What happened was he sent Ulissa co-founder, Eric Danes, a collection of several hours of all these different sort of takes and versions of his songs, and then Danes selected the recordings that would form this finished album, and he kind of assembled them into this cohesive whole. So while it's the case that the record presents the sort of life's work of Stephen Hall, it was actually Danes who fitted this sort of jigsaw together. Despite the fact that there were all these pieces to choose from, he kind of managed to make it something a bit more navigable, I suppose. So yeah, a large part of the intrigue surrounding this album, I suppose, comes from the enormous period of time over which it was recorded. You know, he has said in interviews the earliest recordings on the album date back to the early 1980s, which would put him in his sort of early to mid 20s. And the most recent song on the album was recorded last year when he would have been either 67 or 68. You know, most albums are organized around maybe like a particular idea or sound or concept. My Skyscraper is different. It's almost like an autobiography, I suppose. You're listening to this very carefully curated but non-linear life story from a man who spent decades allowing his surroundings to shape his music, and his music to shape the way that he moves through the world as well. But, you know, I wrote all this, and then I kind of thought, there's still something missing here. There's still kind of an overarching point missing. You know, all these people are talking about this album, and it's been completely inescapable for me online, I suppose. But, you know, just because you have a famous collaborator and just because you have an unusual creative process, that explains the initial appeal of the album. It doesn't explain why the conversation persists beyond the first listen to the album. Everyone has a story. And to put it really bluntly, why should I care about Stephen Hall's? During the 1970s, John Martyn's Solid Air inspired his approach to singing, and you can hear that influence on tracks such as Grey Boy and the aforementioned You Have Eaten My Assistant, where Hall's strained performances are equally moving and discomforting. Later in the decade and into the 1980s, acts such as Parliament, Funkadelic, Sly and the Family Stone would influence his guitar playing, and that influence resurfaces in the addictive progressions of songs like Fresh Feeling and Special Weakness. And the DNA of the New York disco scene runs throughout the record. You know, you've got songs like First Love, for example, and you can kind of lose yourself completely in the dance floor euphoria of that kind of thing. His exposure to East Asian music perhaps is slightly subtler, but that's by design largely. He recorded a Mandarin version of Lost in Thought as well, but it actually didn't make the final album. I don't think I could discuss this record without mentioning my personal favourite song, which is Superboy. It's this really gorgeous story of yearning, and it's set against this weightless, down-tempo instrumental. It's got these stuttering drums, buzzing bass, and a really, really sexy guitar rhythm as well. Lyrically and thematically, his entire life is here on this record. His poetry studies, his work with Fagin and Ginsberg is heard in the sort of blunt and endearing writing. Queer love and lust run all throughout this album. There's an interest in sex and pornography that doesn't really appear to have waned with age. At least 5 of the 17 songs on this record, New Boy, Superboy, Grey Boy, Boss Tricks, Benny's song, and Jovi's song, they appear to have been written with a particular love interest at the center of the song. But, you know, don't get me wrong, his libido is not the only thing that's remained constant over the years. His wit, his charm, his sincerity, they all sort of persist throughout the record. This is not a chronological account of his life over the span of 40 years. It is a collage of stories in which a 20-something Stephen Hall, who's kind of overwhelmed by being in New York City, it can coexist with a 50-year-old Stephen Hall, who's attending these organized orgy parties in Thailand. These sounds, these ideas, they're not blended into one sort of smooth, conventional arc. The record, it's compelling and beautiful, but it's also messy and complicated, and I think that reflects the themes really well of the record. It reflects the themes of religion and sex and life and all these kinds of things. There's no conventional flow to the album, which you can kind of forgive, maybe, given the several decades it was recorded across, but it doesn't really ever feel jarring or disjointed or anything like that. Its kind of coherence doesn't come from one single sonic palette. It comes from the fact that his identity is never obscured on this record. So, to put it simply, I think My Skyscraper, I would say it's a genre agnostic masterclass. Thematically, sonically, lyrically, it's all there. His respect for Arthur Russell is very evident, both as a musician, a songwriter, and as a person as well. But by the time that the album concludes, it's really clear that this record doesn't need to be understood through the perspective of an Arthur Russell fan. He kind of emerges as an exceptional musician and songwriter in his own right, and his legitimacy isn't kind of dependent on how people are comparing him with Arthur Russell. So while the initial attention may have come from his connection to Arthur Russell, along with other things like the sort of scarcity of his recorded catalogue, the kind of wild time frame and process behind the project, it was Eric Danes, his sort of curation, that gave listeners an accessible way in, and it was the quality of the album that sort of justified that curiosity. And then word got round, Pitchfork picked it up. There was that Tone Glow interview I talked about that's really interesting, and I'll link to that in the description so you can go and read it. And just a little bit of social media word of mouth. I saw people talking about this album maybe the day before it came out, kind of popped up on my social media feeds, and that kind of has expanded the audience until eventually I've felt compelled to talk about this myself. When you listen to My Skyscraper, you are listening to a life story. He bears everything, he hides nothing, and you can take as much or as little from him as you want. Like I said, 3 weeks ago, I'd never even heard of Nirosta Steel, and now I feel as though I understand Stephen Hall better than artists I've been listening to for years. And if you enjoy listening to people's life stories, consider out checking this video on your screen right now, where I explore my own personal relationship with the album Because the Internet by Childish Gambino. Anyway, I'm on the floor, so I'm going to get up now.